The plane fell silent as Jasmine Williams collapsed to her knees in the aisle, clutching her wailing 6-month-old son against her chest. 24 hours earlier, she'd been just another passenger. Now, surrounded by federal officers, she realized one racist flight attendant had just changed her life forever. Before we dive into this shocking story of discrimination at 30,000 feet, where are you watching from today? Take a second to drop your location in the comments. If this kind of injustice makes your blood boil, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed about stories that the mainstream media often overlooks. Now let's find out how a routine flight turned into a nightmare for this black mother and her infant son. Jasmine Williams stood in front of her bedroom mirror, carefully securing her curly hair into a neat bun. At 32, the accomplished pediatrician had faced countless challenges in her career at Chicago Memorial Hospital, but today brought an entirely new kind of anxiety. This would be her first flight with 6-month-old Marcus, a journey to Atlanta to introduce her son to his great-grandmother before her health deteriorated further. "You've got this," she told her reflection, watching as Marcus kicked happily in his travel bassinet behind her. "We've planned for everything." As a single mother by choice through IVF, Jasmine had weathered disapproving glances and intrusive questions from the moment she announced her pregnancy. The predominantly white hospital where she worked had been supportive on paper, but the microaggressions never stopped. Colleagues expressing surprise at her articulate speech during presentations, patients requesting American doctors when seeing her name on the door, and the constant need to prove her credentials when white counterparts were simply taken at their word. Traveling with Marcus would present a whole new set of challenges. For the past week, Jasmine had researched every aspect of flying with an infant, joining online parenting groups and consulting with her pediatrician colleagues. Marcus had several allergies that required a special formula, which Jasmine had carefully measured into individual bottles, each labeled with feeding times. She'd memorized TSA regulations about traveling with baby liquids and carried printed documentation of Marcus's medical needs. "You've packed enough formula for 3 days even though it's a 2-hour flight," her sister Ayana said, leaning against the doorframe. "And enough diapers for a month." Jasmine smiled, zipping up the final compartment of her meticulously organized diaper bag. "Better over-prepared than under-prepared. Remember Mom's motto." "I'm just saying, Atlanta has stores too," Ayana laughed, picking up Marcus and covering his chubby cheeks with kisses. "My gorgeous nephew's first flight. Are you excited to see Great-Grandma Esther?" Marcus gurgled happily, unaware of the significance of the journey ahead. Esther Williams was 92, a civil rights veteran who had marched with Dr. King and spent her life fighting for equality. She had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 3 months ago, and Jasmine couldn't bear the thought of her passing without meeting her great-grandson. The morning of the flight arrived with an early alarm and a flurry of last-minute preparations. Ayana drove them to O'Hare, the car filled with Jasmine's anxious reminders about Marcus's schedule. "His ears might hurt during takeoff and landing, so I need to feed him then. And if he gets fussy, I have his favorite toy, and the pacifier, and the backup pacifier, and the backup to the backup." "Jazz," Ayana interrupted gently, "you're overthinking this. You're literally a pediatrician. If anyone knows how to handle a baby on a flight, it's you." Jasmine took a deep breath. "You're right, I'm just nervous. Text me when you land," Ayana said, pulling up to the departures curb. She helped unload the stroller, car seat, and luggage, then gave both Jasmine and Marcus tight hugs. "Great-Grandma Esther is going to be so proud of both of you." The first sign of trouble came at the security checkpoint. Despite having all documentation ready, the TSA agent eyed the row of formula bottles suspiciously. "All of these need to be tested," he said, picking up one bottle and examining it. "They're medically necessary," Jasmine explained, presenting Marcus's allergy documentation. "My son has specific dietary requirements." The agent's eyes flicked from the paperwork to Jasmine's face with unconcealed skepticism. "And that's a Prada diaper bag?" Jasmine stiffened. "Yes. Is that relevant to my son's formula?" A second agent approached, glancing at Jasmine's carry-on. "That's an expensive suitcase for just a weekend trip." Jasmine felt her chest tighten with familiar indignation. The implications were clear. How could a black woman afford such items? Must be something suspicious going on. "I'm a physician," she said calmly, though her heart raced. "Now can we please proceed with whatever testing you need to do for my son's formula? Our flight boards in 40 minutes. The agents exchanged glances before calling over a supervisor, who finally cleared the formula after an additional 15 minutes of scrutiny. By the time Jasmine reached the gate, boarding had already begun. Struggling with the stroller, car seat, and carry-on while keeping Marcus secure was a logistical challenge that none of the gate agents offered to help with. As she navigated the narrow airplane aisle, she heard whispered comments from several passengers. "Hope that baby stays quiet for the whole flight. Why do people bring infants on planes anyway?" Jasmine focused on getting settled, securing Marcus in his carrier attached to the window seat. Most of the flight attendants greeted her warmly as they passed, offering assistance with stowing her bags. But one, the head flight attendant whose name tag read Veronica Pearson, merely gave her a cold once-over before continuing down the aisle without acknowledgement. Jasmine noticed how Veronica stopped to coo at a white toddler across the aisle, offering the parents extra pillows and a warm blanket. When Jasmine pressed the call button minutes later to request a blanket for Marcus, Veronica sent another attendant instead of coming herself. It was a small slight, something Jasmine had learned to recognize but not dwell on. After all, she was used to navigating these waters. Today was about Marcus meeting his great-grandmother, not about confronting yet another person's prejudice. She settled into her seat, prepared Marcus's bottle for takeoff, and hoped for an uneventful flight. What she couldn't know was that this flight would be anything but uneventful. The next 2 hours would not only test her patience but her very identity as a mother, a professional, and a black woman in America. And it would all begin with a bottle of baby formula and a flight attendant determined to make an example of her. The Boeing 737 climbed steadily through the clouds, leaving Chicago's skyline far behind. Jasmine gazed out the window while cradling Marcus, who had fallen asleep after his feeding during takeoff. She allowed herself to relax slightly. Perhaps this wouldn't be as stressful as she'd anticipated. That moment of peace lasted exactly 3 minutes and 27 seconds. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Marcus awoke with a startled cry. The change in pressure had clearly bothered his sensitive ears, and his wails quickly filled the cabin. Jasmine immediately went into action, bouncing him gently while reaching for his pacifier. "Shh, it's okay, baby," she whispered, keenly aware of the irritated sighs from nearby passengers. The businessman behind her kicked her seat, not hard enough to be overtly aggressive, but deliberately enough to send a message. Jasmine ignored it, focusing entirely on soothing Marcus. "First flight?" asked the woman in the aisle seat beside her, a Latina woman in her 40s who had introduced herself as Elena Rodriguez during boarding. Jasmine nodded, still bouncing Marcus. "His ears are bothering him." "Try this," Elena suggested, miming a gentle massage behind the ear. Worked wonders with my 3 kids. Grateful for the advice rather than judgment, Jasmine tried the technique. To her relief, Marcus's cries began to subside as she gently massaged the area around his ears. Just as he was beginning to calm, a sharp voice cut through the cabin. "You need to control that child immediately." Veronica Pearson stood in the aisle, her perfectly made-up face twisted into a mask of irritation. Her gaze fixed coldly on Jasmine, deliberately avoiding looking at Marcus. "I'm sorry," Jasmine replied evenly, continuing to comfort her son. "He's having trouble with the pressure. He's calming down now." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "Well, other passengers are trying to enjoy their flight without disruption." At that exact moment, the white toddler across the aisle, the one Veronica had fawned over earlier, began a tantrum, screaming and kicking the seat in front of him. His mother tried to calm him with a tablet, but the volume was turned up high, adding to the noise. Jasmine waited for Veronica to address this disruption with the same stern admonishment. Instead, the flight attendant smiled sympathetically at the white family before turning back to Jasmine with a hardened expression. "Just keep him quiet," she said before walking away. Elena raised an eyebrow. Interesting how that works, isn't it? I've seen worse, Jasmine murmured, though the double standard stung as it always did. The next hour passed without incident. Marcus settled into a peaceful rhythm, occasionally babbling happily and charming several nearby passengers. Jasmine checked her watch. It was approaching his next feeding time, and she wanted to prepare before he got hungry and fussy again. As she reached into her bag for the pre-prepared formula, she noticed Veronica watching her from the galley, whispering to another flight attendant while pointing subtly in her direction. The second attendant looked uncomfortable, but nodded along with whatever Veronica was saying. Jasmine tried to ignore the scrutiny as she prepared Marcus's bottle. The specialized formula for his allergies had a slightly different appearance than standard formula, slightly darker and thicker. She tested the temperature on her wrist, a motion every parent would recognize. Just as she was about to begin feeding Marcus, who had started fussing in anticipation of his meal, Veronica strode purposefully down the aisle and stopped directly beside their row. "Ma'am, what are you giving that baby?" Her voice was loud, enough that several rows of passengers turned to look. "His formula," Jasmine replied calmly. "He's due for his feeding." Marcus began to cry harder, straining toward the bottle. Jasmine tried to position him to begin feeding, but Veronica stepped closer, her body language confrontational. "That doesn't look like any baby formula I've ever seen," she announced, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I'm going to need to inspect that substance." A hot flush of embarrassment and anger swept over Jasmine. "This is medically prescribed formula for my son's allergies. I've been feeding him the same thing since we boarded." "I didn't see you giving him anything unusual before," Veronica countered, her voice rising. "And as the safety manager on this flight, I need to be certain about any suspicious liquids being consumed." The word suspicious hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several passengers had begun filming the interaction on their phones. "Suspicious?" Jasmine repeated, struggling to maintain her professional composure. "There's nothing suspicious about baby formula." Veronica leaned in closer. "I need you to hand over that bottle for testing immediately." Marcus was now screaming with hunger, his tiny face reddened with distress. Jasmine held him closer, protectively. "My son is hungry. I will not deny him his medically necessary nutrition. I'm a pediatrician, and I can assure you this is formula." "I don't care what you claim to be," Veronica snapped, the veneer of professionalism slipping. "Hand over the bottle now, or I'll be forced to report non-compliance with crew instructions, which is a federal offense," Elena intervened from the aisle seat. "Excuse me, but I've been sitting here the whole time. She's only giving her baby formula." Veronica ignored her completely, focusing her hostile gaze on Jasmine. "Last chance to comply voluntarily before I involve the captain." Jasmine felt every eye in the cabin on her. Some passengers looked concerned, others judgmental. A few had their phones raised, still recording. But all she could truly focus on was her hungry, distressed son. In that moment, Jasmine made a decision that would alter the course of the flight and much more. She looked Veronica directly in the eyes and said, "My son will be fed. Now." And with that, she brought the bottle to Marcus's lips, watching as he eagerly began to drink his formula, his cries immediately subsiding into the soft sounds of contented feeding. Veronica's face flushed with anger. "You are now officially in violation of crew member instructions," she hissed. "I'll be informing the captain that we have an uncooperative passenger who will need to be removed at our next landing point." As she stormed away toward the cockpit, Jasmine continued feeding Marcus, her hand trembling slightly, but her resolve firm. What had begun as a simple journey to visit family had suddenly transformed into a confrontation with much higher stakes. The standoff had begun, and 30,000 feet above the earth, Jasmine Williams found herself fighting not just for her dignity, but for her son's most basic needs, all because one flight attendant couldn't see past the color of her skin. What happens when a mother's right to care for her child collides with prejudice disguised as authority? How far would you go to protect your baby when the system itself seems designed to break you down? If you've ever witnessed discrimination firsthand, type 1 in the comments. If you believe airlines need better training on racial bias, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed, because you won't want to miss how this confrontation reaches its breaking point. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Veronica strode back down the aisle, this time accompanied by a male flight attendant whose name tag read Trevor Matthews. His expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, but he maintained a professional demeanor as they approached Jasmine's row. Jasmine had just finished feeding Marcus, who was now contentedly dozing against her shoulder. She had also taken out her phone and pulled up the medical documentation for his formula, ready to defend herself again if necessary. "Ma'am," Trevor began, his voice measured, "Flight attendant Pearson has expressed concerns about an unapproved substance being given to your infant. Could you please explain what you're feeding him?" Before Jasmine could respond, Veronica interjected. "I've already asked her multiple times to surrender the substance for testing. She's being uncooperative." Jasmine took a deep breath, channeling the same calm authority she used when delivering difficult news to patients' families. "This is a hypoallergenic formula prescribed by my son's pediatrician," she explained, showing them the documentation on her phone. "Marcus has several severe allergies that require this specific formulation. I brought medical documentation which I can show you." Trevor leaned in to examine the documentation, but Veronica waved it off dismissively. "Anyone could fake paperwork like that," she scoffed. "And that doesn't look like any prescription formula I've ever seen. It looks suspicious." Jasmine felt her professional composure beginning to crack. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Veronica said with a thin smile that suggested otherwise. "I'm simply following protocol for suspicious substances." "Is it protocol to harass mothers feeding their babies?" Elena interjected from beside Jasmine. "Or just the black ones?" Veronica's eyes flashed. "Keep out of this unless you want to," be reported as well. By now, the confrontation had drawn the attention of the entire cabin. Some passengers were openly filming, while others whispered among themselves. Jasmine noticed the cabin dividing into factions, several passengers nodding in agreement with Veronica, while others looked concerned about the treatment Jasmine was receiving. A white woman across the aisle stood up. "I think you're being ridiculous," she told Veronica. "That's obviously baby formula. Leave her alone." "Ma'am, please remain seated," Trevor instructed, his discomfort with the situation increasingly evident. From several rows back, a middle-aged white man in a business suit called out, "If the flight attendant has concerns, the woman should comply. It's about safety. What's unsafe about feeding a hungry baby?" countered another passenger. As the cabin erupted into competing voices, Marcus began to whimper again, disturbed by the rising tension around him. Jasmine gently bounced him, trying to shield him from the chaos she now found herself at the center of. "Look," Jasmine said, addressing Trevor since he seemed more reasonable. "I understand you have protocols, but I also have a responsibility to my son. This formula is medically necessary. It costs nearly $30 a bottle because of his specific allergies. I'm a pediatrician myself, and I would never give him anything harmful." Veronica snorted. $30 a bottle? And I'm supposed to believe you can afford that? The implication hung heavy in the air. Several gasps came from nearby passengers who recognized the blatant racism of the comment. Jasmine felt a surge of anger unlike anything she'd experienced before. "Excuse me? What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Veronica said, leaning in closer, "that I find it hard to believe you're really a doctor or that this is really prescription formula." Jasmine reached for her phone. "I'm recording this conversation now," she said, her voice shaking slightly with controlled rage. "And I'd like you to clarify why you think I can't afford proper care for my son." "Phones need to be in airplane mode during flight," Veronica snapped, reaching for Jasmine's device. "That's another violation." "Don't touch my property," Jasmine warned, pulling her phone away. What happened next occurred in a flash. Veronica lunged for the phone, her arm knocking against Jasmine's shoulder where Marcus was resting. The baby's head jerked backward, and he let out a startled wail. Jasmine instinctively turned to protect him, nearly dropping her phone in the process. "You just endangered my child," Jasmine shouted, all pretense of calm professionalism gone. You physically jostled my baby. Trevor moved between them, looking alarmed. Everyone needs to calm down right now. But Veronica was already backing away, her expression shifting from aggression to a practiced victim pose. She's becoming aggressive, she announced loudly. I was merely enforcing the electronics policy, and she became threatening. That's a lie, Elena exclaimed. You reached for her phone and hit her shoulder where the baby was resting. Trevor looked uncertainly between them, clearly out of his depth. Other passengers were loudly taking sides now, some defending Jasmine, others supporting Veronica's version of events. The plane's PA system crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a situation in the cabin, we will be making an unscheduled landing in Charlotte, North Carolina. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. A wave of groans and complaints swept through the plane. Veronica shot Jasmine a triumphant look before leaning in close. Interfering with a flight crew is a federal offense, she whispered. You'll be met by security when we land. As Veronica walked away to prepare for landing, Jasmine felt a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. What had started as simple discrimination was now escalating into something that could have serious legal consequences. As a black woman being accused of aggression by a white authority figure, she knew exactly how this script typically played out. Elena leaned over. Do you have someone you can call when we land? Jasmine nodded numbly, her mind racing through options. She noticed Elena discreetly slip a business card into her hand. I'm a civil rights attorney, Elena whispered. That woman is way out of line, and you have a plane full of witnesses. Don't say anything to security without representation. As the plane began its descent, Jasmine held Marcus close, her mind racing. She had done nothing wrong except stand up for her son's basic needs. Yet somehow, she now faced the prospect of being removed from a plane by security, possibly even arrested. All because one flight attendant couldn't see past her own prejudices. Would your blood be boiling if you were in Jasmine's situation? Comment 2 if you believe she's handling this with incredible restraint. How much more can she endure before something breaks? And what will happen when this plane touches down in Charlotte? The situation is about to take an unexpected turn that nobody, especially flight attendant Veronica, saw coming. The fasten seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding as the plane began its unscheduled descent into Charlotte Douglas International Airport. Through the window, Jasmine could see the sprawling city growing closer, each passing second bringing her nearer to an uncertain confrontation. Marcus had finally settled into a fitful sleep against her chest, unaware of the storm brewing around his mother. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice crackled through the speakers. We'll be landing in approximately 15 minutes. Upon arrival, we ask that all passengers remain seated until further instructions are given. The cabin hummed with tension and whispered conversations. Jasmine could feel eyes on her, some sympathetic, others accusatory. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone and switched it off airplane mode, knowing she had precious little time before they landed. You should text someone, Elena advised quietly from beside her. Get support lined up before we land. Jasmine nodded, quickly typing a message to her sister. Flight making emergency landing in Charlotte. Being targeted by racist flight attendant. For feeding Marcus. Might be met by security. Call Dr. Carter if you don't hear from me in an hour. She attached several video clips she'd managed to record during the confrontations, then hit send just as service became available. The message, delivered with a soft whoosh that felt absurdly inadequate for the gravity of the situation. Elena leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Listen carefully. When security comes, they'll try to separate you from other passengers to control the narrative. Don't go anywhere private without witnesses. My cousin works for the NAACP. Legal Defense Fund, I can connect you if needed. Jasmine swallowed hard. Thank you. This wasn't supposed to happen. It never is, Elena replied, a lifetime of understanding in her eyes. But you have rights, and more importantly, you have witnesses. This isn't the 1960s where they can just haul you away without consequences. The 1960s. The words triggered a memory of her grandmother Esther, who had faced down fire hoses and police dogs during civil rights marches. "Stand your ground with dignity," Esther always said, "but know when to call in reinforcements." Reinforcements. Jasmine's thoughts immediately went to Dr. Raymond Carter, the chief of surgery at her hospital and her longtime mentor. As one of the few black chiefs of surgery in the country, he had navigated institutional racism for decades, building networks and alliances in the process. More importantly, he sat on several corporate boards, including, if she remembered correctly, an airline regulatory committee. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, taxiing toward the terminal. Through the window, Jasmine could see 2 airport security vehicles waiting on the tarmac, their lights flashing silently in the midday sun. "All passengers, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," Veronica announced, her voice carrying a note of smug satisfaction as she glanced toward Jasmine's row. "We have a security matter to address before deplaning can begin." Jasmine made a quick decision. Pulling out her phone again, she discreetly dialed Dr. Carter's direct line, praying he wasn't in surgery. To her immense relief, he answered on the 3rd ring. "Jasmine, aren't you supposed to be in Atlanta by now?" "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice low but urgent. "I'm on a flight that just made an emergency landing in Charlotte because a flight attendant is targeting me for feeding. Marcus, they're calling it a security incident, and there are officers waiting to remove me from the plane." There was a beat of silence before Dr. Carter replied, his voice shifting from confusion to focused determination. "Tell me exactly what happened. Quick version." In 30 seconds flat, Jasmine outlined the events, emphasizing Veronica's comments about not believing she was a doctor and questioning how she could afford specialized formula. "Unbelievable," Dr. Carter muttered. "But not surprising. Is the baby okay?" "Yes, he's fine, just exhausted from crying." "Good. Now listen carefully, Jasmine. When security boards, tell them Dr. Raymond Carter, board member of the Hospital Association of American Medical Professionals and advisory committee member to the Federal Aviation Administration's Passenger Rights Division, would like to speak with the ranking officer." Jasmine blinked in surprise. She knew Dr. Carter was well connected, but this was beyond what she'd imagined. "The FAA? Advisory committee," he clarified. "But they don't need to know exactly how advisory. Now stay calm, keep Marcus close, and put me on speaker when they approach you." The plane door opened, and 2 airport security officers boarded, followed by a man in a pilot's uniform who wasn't the captain who had been flying the plane. They conferred briefly with Veronica, who pointed directly at Jasmine's row. "That's her," Veronica said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. She became aggressive when asked to comply with safety protocols. The security officers made their way down the aisle, faces impassive. Passengers watched in tense silence, many still recording with their phones. "Ms. Williams," the first officer said as they reached her row, "we need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Jasmine remained seated, Marcus still sleeping, against her chest. "My son is sleeping and I've done nothing wrong. Before we proceed, I have Dr. Raymond Carter on the phone, who would like to speak with your supervisor." The officer looked taken aback. "Ma'am, you need to come with us now. You can make calls once we're off the aircraft." "Officer?" Jasmine replied calmly. "Dr. Carter is the advisory committee member to the FAA's Passenger Rights Division and would like to speak with whoever is in charge of this situation immediately." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the officer's face. He glanced at his partner, who shrugged slightly. "Put him on speaker," the second officer said after a moment's hesitation. Jasmine tapped the speaker button on her phone. "Dr. Carter, I have the security officers here. This is Dr. Raymond Carter." His authoritative voice filled the space between them. "To whom am I speaking?" "Officer James Wilson, Charlotte Douglas Airport Security," the first officer replied, his demeanor subtly shifting. "Officer Wilson, I understand there's been an incident involving Dr. Jasmine Williams and her infant son. Before any further action is taken, I need to speak with your commanding officer and the highest-ranking airline representative on site. This situation has serious implications that need to be addressed at the appropriate level." The confidence in Dr. Carter's voice worked its magic. Officer Wilson's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "One moment, sir." He stepped away to make a call, while the second officer remained watching Jasmine, though with notably less intensity than before. Veronica, who had been hovering nearby, approached with visible agitation. "What's happening? She needs to be removed immediately for interfering with flight crew duties." The second officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, we're following procedure. Please return to your station." For the first time since the confrontation began, Veronica looked uncertain. She glanced between Jasmine and the officers, then retreated toward the front of the plane. Officer Wilson returned after a brief conversation. "Dr. Carter, I have Captain Reynolds, our security supervisor, on the line. I'm transferring you to him now." Jasmine couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Dr. Carter's voice remained measured and authoritative as he explained the situation, dropping references to hospital boards, airline stakeholders, and various committees that sounded impressively official. After several minutes, Officer Wilson received the phone back, listened to instructions, then addressed Jasmine directly. "Dr. Williams, we've been instructed to stand by while this matter is investigated further. You're to remain on the aircraft for now." A wave of relief washed over Jasmine. "Thank you, officer. We'll be stationed at the door," he added before both officers retreated to the front of the plane. Veronica watched this development with visible confusion, then hurried to confer with the pilot who had boarded earlier. Their conversation appeared heated, with Veronica gesticulating forcefully while the pilot maintained a more reserved demeanor. The minutes stretched into a half hour. Passengers grew increasingly restless, many voicing complaints about the delay. Some directed their frustration at Jasmine, while others blamed the airline for the unnecessary drama. During this time, Jasmine fed Marcus again without interference, pointedly making eye contact with Veronica across the cabin as she did so. Finally, a new figure boarded the plane, a woman in a crisp airline uniform with executive insignia. She headed straight for the cockpit, bypassing Veronica completely. "What's happening?" Jasmine whispered to Elena, who had remained steadfastly by her side. "Something big," Elena replied with a small smile. "That's not just any supervisor. Those are regional director stripes on her jacket." Veronica stood near the galley, her earlier confidence evaporating as she watched the newcomer enter the cockpit. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time since the conflict began, Jasmine allowed herself to hope that perhaps justice might actually prevail at 30,000 feet. The mood aboard the stationary aircraft had shifted from tense confrontation to simmering frustration as the 30-minute mark of their unscheduled ground delay passed. Passengers checked watches, sighed heavily, and peppered flight attendants, except Veronica, who had mysteriously disappeared into the forward galley with increasingly pointed questions. The cockpit door finally opened, and the woman with the regional director insignia emerged, her expression professionally neutral but her body language resolute. She conferred briefly with the security officers, still stationed at the front of the aircraft, before approaching Veronica in the galley. Even from her seat, Jasmine could see Veronica's face drain of color as the regional director spoke to her in hushed but clearly firm tones. The once imperious flight attendant now looked small, her shoulders hunched defensively as she nodded repeatedly. The plane's PA system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Catherine Wilson, Regional Operations Director for Atlantic Airways. I apologize for the continued delay. Due to an internal staffing issue, all passengers will need to deplane while we arrange for a replacement crew. You'll be directed to a gate where refreshments will be provided, and our team will assist with connection information." A collective groan rose from the cabin, followed by a flurry of questions shouted toward the front. "What about our connecting flights? Will we be compensated for this delay? Is this going to affect our entire travel day?" Catherine raised her hands placatingly. "All passengers will receive meal vouchers and appropriate compensation through our customer service app. Now, please gather your belongings and proceed to exit the aircraft in an orderly fashion. Our gate agents will assist you from there." As passengers begrudgingly collected their items, Catherine made her way down the aisle directly to Jasmine's row. Several passengers glared at Jasmine as they passed, clearly blaming her for their disrupted travel plans. while others offered subtle nods of solidarity. "Dr. Williams," Catherine said quietly, kneeling beside her seat. "I'm Catherine Wilson, Regional Director. I'd like to apologize for what you've experienced today. Would you be willing to remain aboard briefly after other passengers deplane?" "I'd like to speak with you privately." Jasmine glanced at Elena, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. "Yes, that would be fine," Jasmine replied cautiously. Elena scribbled her phone number on a napkin and pressed it into Jasmine's hand as she stood to leave. "Call me if you need anything," she whispered. "And remember, you did nothing wrong." As the last passengers filtered out, Catherine returned to Jasmine's row, accompanied by the security officers who had positioned themselves several rows away, close enough to respond if needed, but far enough to give them privacy. "First, let me be absolutely clear," Catherine began, her voice low but firm. "What happened to you today was unacceptable. We've reviewed multiple passenger videos that were already circulating on social media and conducted preliminary interviews with crew members." Jasmine adjusted Marcus, who had woken and was observing the empty plane with curious eyes. "So you believe me?" "The evidence is overwhelming," Catherine confirmed. "Ms. Pearson's conduct violated multiple company policies regarding passenger dignity, non-discrimination protocols, and appropriate conflict resolution. She's been removed from duty pending a formal investigation." As if on cue, Veronica appeared at the front of the cabin, escorted by a third security officer. She was no longer in uniform. Her flight attendant's scarf and jacket had been removed, leaving her in just the white blouse and dark pants. Most tellingly, her airline credentials were missing from around her neck. Veronica's eyes met Jasmine's. Briefly, a complex mixture of emotions flashing across her face before she was led off the aircraft without being allowed to speak. "Is she being arrested?" Jasmine asked, surprised by her own lack of satisfaction at seeing Veronica's downfall. Catherine shook her head. "No, but she's been suspended pending a full investigation, and her flight privileges have been temporarily revoked. She'll be escorted from the secure area." She hesitated, then added, "I should inform you that the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack is trending nationally. Several passenger videos have already garnered hundreds of thousands of views." Jasmine closed, her eyes briefly. Public attention was the last thing she wanted, especially with her professional reputation potentially at stake. "I never intended for this to become a social media spectacle." "Few people do," Catherine replied sympathetically. "But perhaps some good can come from it. Our airline has prided itself on inclusive policies, but clearly we have work to do in translating those policies into consistent employee behavior." She straightened, shifting back to a more businesslike demeanor. "Now, regarding your travel plans, we have a flight departing for Atlanta in 90 minutes. I've arranged for you and your son to be accommodated in first class with a private pre-boarding opportunity to ensure your comfort." Jasmine considered this. All she wanted was to reach her grandmother without further incident, but she also recognized the importance of properly documenting what had occurred. "I appreciate that offer," she said carefully, "but I'll need formal documentation of today's incident for my records, including an official statement acknowledging the discrimination I experienced." Catherine nodded. "Of course. Our customer advocacy team is preparing a formal incident report. I'll personally ensure you receive a copy, along with a written acknowledgement of the inappropriate treatment you received." A soft knock at the aircraft door interrupted them. A new flight crew entered, led by a black female flight attendant whose name tag read Tanya Green. She approached with a warm, professional smile. "Dr. Williams, I'm Tanya, your lead flight attendant for the continuing service to Atlanta. We're ready whenever you are, and we'll do everything possible to make the remainder of your journey comfortable." The contrast between Tanya's respectful approach and Veronica's hostility couldn't have been more stark. Jasmine felt a small weight lift from her shoulders, not the entire burden of the day's events, but enough to breathe a little easier. As if sensing the change in atmosphere, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed Atlantic Airways Executive Office. Catherine raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to take it. "This is Jasmine Williams," she answered, keeping her voice steady despite her surprise. "Dr. Williams, this is Thomas Blackwell, Chief Operations Officer for Atlantic Airways, came a voice that radiated corporate authority. I've been briefed on the inexcusable incident you experienced on our flight today. I wanted to personally extend the airline's deepest apologies and assure you that we're taking immediate steps to address both the specific incident and our broader training protocols. Jasmine listened as the executive continued, outlining a series of commitments ranging from personal compensation to promises of improved crew training on unconscious bias. The rapid escalation from being threatened with removal to receiving a call from a C-suite executive was dizzying. "While I appreciate your call, Mr. Blackwell," Jasmine replied once he'd finished, "I'm more interested in systemic changes than personal compensation. What specific steps will Atlantic Airways take to ensure other passengers of color don't face similar discrimination?" There was a brief pause before he answered, perhaps surprised by her focus on policy over personal benefit. "A fair question, Dr. Williams. We're implementing mandatory refresher training on unconscious bias for all customer-facing staff, revising our complaint escalation procedures, and establishing a passenger advocacy council with diverse representation to review our policies. I'd like documentation of these commitments as well," Jasmine said firmly. "Of course. We'll have everything prepared before your arrival in Atlanta." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you understand that Ms. Pearson's actions today do not reflect our company values or the behavior we expect from our employees." After ending the call, Jasmine gathered her belongings while Catherine and Tanya waited patiently. As they escorted her through the jetway, Jasmine noticed many of the original passengers waiting at the gate, some with expressions of embarrassment when they saw her, others still filming with their phones. The passenger who had loudly supported Veronica earlier now stared at his shoes as she passed. The woman who had defended Jasmine approached briefly to squeeze her hand in solidarity before backing away from the cameras that had materialized from local news outlets, somehow already alerted to the story. As Jasmine was escorted to a private lounge to await her connecting flight, she reflected on how quickly life could change. That morning, she had been a doctor and mother embarking on a simple family visit. Now she was unwittingly becoming the center of a national conversation about race, authority, and the indignities that still plagued Black Americans in everyday situations. All because she had done nothing more controversial than feed her hungry child. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of their race? How would you have responded if you were on Jasmine's flight? Type 3 in the comments if you believe more people should speak up when they witness discrimination. Hit that like button if you think airlines need better training to prevent these incidents. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next in Atlanta will show just how deep this problem really goes. The wheels of the Boeing 737 touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with a gentle bump, signaling the end of what should have been a routine 2-hour flight, but had instead become a life-altering ordeal. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Jasmine peered through the window and felt her stomach tighten. Even from this distance, she could make out the small cluster of people waiting at the terminal, some holding professional cameras and microphones. "Ms. Green," she called quietly to Tanya, who had been attentive but respectful of her privacy throughout the flight. "Are those news reporters at our gate?" Tanya leaned over to look, then straightened with a grimace. "I'm afraid so. The videos from your earlier flight have gone viral. Over 2 million views on TikTok alone in the last 3 hours." Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, cradling a sleeping Marcus closer to her chest. The viral spread of her humiliation wasn't surprising in the age of social media, but the reality of facing it hit her hard. She had patients who might see this, colleagues, hospital administrators, people whose opinions affected her professional standing. "Is there another way I can exit?" she asked. Tanya nodded sympathetically. "Let me arrange for a gate agent to meet us with a wheelchair. We can list you as a passenger requiring assistance and take you through the service corridors." "Thank you," Jasmine said with genuine gratitude. As the other first-class passengers began to deplane, Tanya discreetly positioned herself to shield Jasmine from view. A gate agent soon appeared with a wheelchair, and Jasmine was whisked away through a side door before the main cabin passengers even began to exit. The service corridors of the airport were a maze of utilitarian hallways. a parallel world to the gleaming terminals most travelers experienced. The gate agent, a middle-aged black woman named Darlene, pushed the wheelchair briskly while making quiet conversation. "My daughter showed me that video right before my shift," she confided. "Had me seething all afternoon. 27 years I've worked for airlines, and some things never change, just get filmed more often now." They emerged near baggage claim, where Darlene helped Jasmine collect her checked luggage and then guided her toward the exit. "Your grandmother sent a car service," Darlene explained, gesturing toward a professionally dressed driver holding a tablet with Williams displayed on the screen. "She called the airline directly after seeing the news." "Grandma Esther saw the videos?" Jasmine asked, dismayed. "Honey, half of Atlanta has seen those videos by now," Darlene replied gently. "But don't you worry, that flight attendant is the one who should be ashamed, not you." The driver, a soft-spoken man named Jerome, efficiently loaded Jasmine's luggage into a sleek black SUV while she secured Marcus in the car seat that had been thoughtfully pre-installed. As they pulled away from the curb, Jasmine caught sight of several reporters scanning the pickup area, clearly looking for her. "Your grandmother is quite resourceful," Jerome commented as they merged onto the highway. "She called our service, specifically because we have a policy against discussing our clients. You won't have to worry about anyone tracking your location through us." The drive to Esther Williams' historic Victorian home in Atlanta's Old Fourth Ward neighborhood took 30 minutes, during which Jasmine attempted to process the day's events. She had dozens of missed calls and hundreds of notifications on her phone, including several urgent messages from her hospital's public relations department. For now, she silenced the device, focusing instead on the sleeping baby in her arms and the impending reunion with her grandmother. Esther's house came into view, a beautifully preserved two-story home with a wide front porch, one of the few original structures that had survived both urban renewal and gentrification in the Yasai, historically black neighborhood. The house stood as a testament to Esther's tenacity, much like the woman herself. As Jerome carried the luggage up the front steps, the door swung open to reveal Esther Williams, 92 years old, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that had witnessed nearly a century of America's racial evolution and stagnation. "Bring my babies inside quickly," she instructed Jerome, her voice still commanding despite her years. "The vultures will be circling soon enough." Once inside the sanctuary of Esther's home, with its walls adorned with civil rights memorabilia and family photographs spanning generations, Jasmine finally felt the full weight of the day crash down upon her. She gently transferred a still sleeping Marcus to Esther's waiting arms before collapsing onto the vintage sofa, her composure finally cracking. "I just wanted to feed my baby," she whispered, tears flowing freely now. "That's all I was doing, feeding my baby." Esther settled into her rocking chair, cradling her great-grandson with practiced ease despite her advanced age. "I know, child. I know." For several minutes they sat in silence, broken only by Jasmine's quiet sobs and the gentle creaking of Esther's rocker. When Jasmine had regained some composure, Esther spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "You know, when I was marching with Dr. King, we faced fire hoses and police dogs. Today the attacks are more subtle, a flight attendant questioning your formula instead of a police baton cracking your skull. The methods change, but the purpose remains the same: to make us feel we don't belong in spaces they consider theirs." Jasmine wiped her eyes. "I'm a doctor, Grandma. I've worked so hard to build a reputation, to be taken seriously. And in an instant, I was just another angry black woman causing trouble." "That's exactly what they want you to feel," Esther replied, a lifetime of wisdom in her words. "The shame isn't yours to carry. It belongs to that flight attendant and the system that emboldened her to behave that way." Before Jasmine could respond, her phone began vibrating insistently. Glancing at the screen, she saw her sister Ayana's name flashing. "You should take that," Esther advised. "The world won't stop spinning just because you need a moment to breathe." Jasmine answered the call, immediately greeted by Ayana's frantic voice. "Jazz, thank God you're okay. Your videos are everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, everywhere. The hospital put out a statement supporting you. but they've also placed you on paid administrative leave for your protection. What does that even mean? Wait, what? Administrative leave? Jasmine straightened, alarm replacing exhaustion. I didn't do anything wrong. They're saying it's standard procedure when an employee is involved in a high-profile incident that might bring media attention to the hospital, Ayanna explained. Dr. Carter is fighting it, but the board is worried about optics. Optics? Jasmine repeated incredulously. I was discriminated against and they're worried about optics? It gets worse, Ayanna continued. That flight attendant, Veronica something, she gave an interview to some right-wing news outlet claiming she was just following protocol and felt threatened by your aggressive behavior. She's playing the victim, Jazz. Jasmine felt a surge of anger. She physically endangered Marcus. There are dozens of witnesses. I know, but she's spinning it hard. And the airline only put out this vague statement about investigating the incident and taking appropriate action. They're not explicitly supporting you publicly. As Ayanna continued updating her on the rapidly unfolding media storm, Jasmine's phone beeped with an incoming call from Dr. Carter. She promised to call Ayanna back and switched to her mentor's call. Jasmine, Dr. Carter's voice was tight with controlled anger. I'm on my way to Atlanta. The board's decision to place you on leave is unacceptable, and I've told them as much. I've also been doing some digging into this flight attendant's history. What did you find? Jasmine asked, putting the phone on speaker so Esther could hear. 5 previous complaints from minority passengers over the past 18 months, all quietly resolved with vouchers and non-disclosure agreements. This isn't her first rodeo. It's just the first time she got caught on camera. Esther nodded knowingly, her expression grim but unsurprised. The social media response is mixed, Dr. Carter continued. Overwhelming support from many quarters, but also the usual racist trolls claiming you were playing the race card and endangering other passengers. Jasmine thought of Marcus, still peacefully sleeping in his great-grandmother's arms, blissfully, unaware that his simple need for nourishment had sparked a national controversy. How would she explain this world to him as he grew older? How could she prepare him for a society where even a doctor with all her credentials could be reduced to a stereotype in seconds? What should I do? She asked, the question directed as much to Esther as to Dr. Carter. Fight, they answered in unison, neither hesitating for a second. This isn't just about one flight or one flight attendant, Esther elaborated, her eyes fierce despite her frail frame. This is about every black mother who's been questioned, every black professional whose credentials have been doubted, every black person who's had to justify their presence in spaces others take for granted. Dr. Carter's voice resonated with similar conviction. We fight smart and we fight strategic. I'll be there in 3 hours. We'll develop a plan together. As Jasmine ended the call, Marcus finally stirred in Esther's arms, his eyes blinking open to take in his new surroundings. He showed no signs of trauma from the day's events, no awareness that his first flight had become a battlefield in America's ongoing struggle with racism. Looking at him, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of purpose cutting through her exhaustion and fear. This wasn't just about clearing her name or getting justice for one incident. This was about the world Marcus would inherit, and whether he would have to fight the same battles she was fighting now. All right, she said, straightening her shoulders as she gently took Marcus from Esther. Tell me what we need to do. Esther smiled, pride shining in her eyes. First, we feed this beautiful boy. Then we prepare for battle. Has discrimination in everyday situations gotten better or worse in recent years? Do you think social media helps expose these incidents or just inflames tensions? Comment 4. If you believe everyone deserves dignity regardless of race, what would you do if you were in Jasmine's position now? Subscribe to find out how she transforms from victim to advocate as the airline industry faces a long overdue reckoning. The week following the flight incident unfolded with the intensity of a hurricane, with Jasmine squarely at its eye. Esther's living room had transformed into an impromptu command center with laptops, legal pads, and constantly ringing phones, spread across the antique furniture. Dr. Carter had arrived as promised, bringing with him not only moral support, but a strategic mindset shaped by decades of navigating institutional racism at the highest levels of medicine. "Your exclusive interview is confirmed for tomorrow morning," he announced, ending a call with a producer. "Amara Johnson from BNC News. She's respected, thorough, and won't sensationalize your story." Jasmine nodded, bouncing Marcus gently on her knee. The choice to speak publicly had not been an easy one, but after Veronica Pearson's inflammatory interview painting herself as the victim, silence was no longer an option. "Are you sure the hospital won't retaliate further if I do this?" she asked, the worry of her career still weighing heavily. Dr. Carter's expression hardened. "Let them try. I've already reminded the board that placing you on leave could be construed as retaliatory action against a victim of discrimination. They're on thin ice legally, and they know it." The morning of the interview arrived with a flurry of activity. Amara Johnson, a poised black journalist known for her incisive reporting on social justice issues, arrived with a small crew. She set up in Esther's formal sitting room, where civil rights photographs and family portraits provided a powerful backdrop that silently spoke to generations of struggle and perseverance. "We're rolling in 3, 2, 1, the cameraman signaled, and Amara's professional demeanor activated. "I'm here with Dr. Jasmine Williams, the physician and mother at the center of what's being called the flying while black incident that has sparked national conversation about racial discrimination in air travel. Dr. Williams, thank you for speaking with us." Jasmine, dressed in a professional blouse that also allowed her to nurse Marcus discreetly if needed, nodded. "Thank you for covering this story with the seriousness it deserves." "Walk us through what happened on that flight," Amara prompted. With measured precision, Jasmine recounted the events, careful to stick to facts rather than emotions, just as Dr. Carter had advised. She described Veronica's escalating hostility, the double standard applied to white passengers with children, and the physical danger posed to Marcus when Veronica lunged for her phone. "What has been most hurtful about this experience?" Amara asked, her tone compassionate but not pitying. Jasmine considered the question carefully. "The immediate assumption that I was dangerous, that my child's food was suspicious, that I couldn't possibly be a doctor or afford specialized formula. These assumptions weren't based on anything I did. They were based on who I am, and that's the definition of prejudice." The interview continued for nearly an hour, covering not just the incident itself, but the broader context of everyday discrimination faced by Black Americans in public spaces. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, Jasmine felt both drained and strangely empowered. Her truth was on record, unfiltered and undeniable. Amara stayed after the crew packed up, sharing a cup of tea with Jasmine and Esther. "This will air tonight in prime time. Be prepared. It's going to create waves." She wasn't wrong. By midnight, the interview had been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms. The Justice for Jasmine began trending alongside the current flying while black, and several civil rights organizations issued statements of support. The following morning, a courier arrived at Esther's door with a thick envelope bearing Atlantic Airways logo. Inside was a settlement offer that made Jasmine's eyes widen, a substantial six-figure sum, first-class lifetime travel privileges, and a formal apology. The final page, however, contained a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prohibit her from ever discussing the incident publicly again. Dr. Carter reviewed the document, his expression darkening as he reached the NDA. "This is their standard playbook. Throw money at the problem, silence the victim, make no substantive changes to prevent it from happening again." "I'm not signing this," Jasmine said immediately, pushing the papers away. "This isn't about money. It's about accountability and systemic change." Her decision became public when she declined the settlement in a brief statement through her newly hired publicist, demanding instead that Atlantic Airways commit to policy changes and public accountability. The airline's response was swift and hostile, a thinly veiled threat of a countersuit for defamation and business interference. "They're bluffing," Dr. Carter assured her after consulting with the legal team he'd assembled. "They know they'd be eviscerated in discovery. Every racial complaint they've ever received would become public record." While the public battle with the airline escalated, Jasmine faced another unexpected challenge. The chief administrator of her hospital, Dr. Philip Whitman, called personally to suggest she consider the hospital's reputation and find a private resolution to the matter. "We support you, of course," he said, his tone belying his words. "But this continued media attention is disruptive to our healing environment. Some of our donors have expressed concerns." "Donors are concerned about a doctor being discriminated against?" Jasmine asked pointedly. "Or are they concerned about a black doctor refusing to quietly accept discrimination?" The uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. As the battle lines were drawn more clearly, an unexpected coalition began to form around Jasmine. It started with a mother's advocacy group expressing outrage at the endangerment of an infant overfeeding. Medical professionals associations followed, condemning the questioning of a doctor's credentials based on race. Civil rights organizations provided legal resources and public relations support. Then came the insider information. A flight attendant from Atlantic Airways anonymously sent Jasmine screenshots of the company's internal communications, revealing that customer service representatives had been instructed to offer larger vouchers to premium-appearing customers, with complaints, with examples that clearly coded for white, affluent passengers. "This is gold," Dr. Carter said when she forwarded him the emails. "But we need more. We need to show this isn't an isolated incident or a single bad employee." The breakthrough came in the form of a whistleblower, a former Atlantic Airways training coordinator who had left the company over ethical concerns. She provided documented evidence of the airline's poor diversity training record and internal metrics showing disproportionate security incidents involving passengers of color. Just as momentum seemed to be building in Jasmine's favor, Veronica Pearson gave another inflammatory interview, this time claiming she was the victim of reverse racism and a cancel culture mob. She described feeling threatened by Jasmine's aggressive demeanor and insisted she would have treated any passenger the same way regardless of race. The interview sparked a new wave of online harassment targeting Jasmine. Death threats appeared in her social media messages and emails. Someone doxed her Chicago address, forcing Ayanna to temporarily relocate for her safety. "This is how they try to silence us," Esther observed, her voice heavy with the weight of history. "First with institutional power, then with social pressure, and finally with fear." Despite the growing personal cost, Jasmine pressed forward. She filed a formal civil rights complaint with the Department of Transportation, triggering a mandatory federal investigation into Atlantic Airways practices. The complaint detailed not just her experience, but the pattern of similar incidents compiled through the Advocacy Coalition's outreach to other affected passengers. The airline's corporate sponsors began to take notice. 3 major companies announced they were reviewing their partnership with Atlantic Airways in light of the ongoing controversy. The pressure mounted further when a group of influential Black business travelers announced a boycott of the airline until meaningful changes were implemented. Finally, after weeks of resistance, Atlantic Airways CEO Gregory Montgomery was forced to address the situation in a press conference. His carefully worded statement acknowledged areas for improvement in customer service training while stopping, short of admitting any systemic issues. He announced Veronica's termination, but defended the airline's overall practices as industry standard. That evening, as Jasmine watched the press conference replay on Esther's television, her phone rang. With devastating news, Ayanna's voice was tight with restrained tears. "Grandma, Esther's doctor called. Her heart condition is worsening. The stress of everything. They're saying she needs to be hospitalized for monitoring." Jasmine felt her world tilting. In focusing on the fight for justice, had she endangered the very person who had inspired her strength? As Esther was settled into the cardiac care unit later that night, monitors beeping steadily around her diminutive frame, Jasmine faced the most difficult decision of the entire ordeal. Should she accept a partial victory, Veronica's firing, and the CEO's tepid acknowledgement for the sake of her grandmother's health and her own career? Or should she continue pushing for the systemic changes that might prevent other Black mothers from experiencing the same humiliation and danger? As she sat beside Esther's hospital bed, holding Marcus in one arm and her grandmother's frail hand in the other, Jasmine weighed the personal cost against the potential collective gain. Generations of her family had made sacrifices for progress, each advancing the line a little further. But every fighter had to choose their battles wisely. "What would you do, Grandma?" she whispered to Esther's sleeping form, knowing that the answer already lived within her, passed down through blood, and example across the decades of struggle that had brought her to this moment of decision. 3 months after what had begun as a simple feeding on an airplane, Jasmine Williams sat in a wood-paneled hearing room on Capitol Hill, adjusting her blazer as technicians clipped a microphone to her lapel. The congressional hearing on discrimination in air transportation, patterns and practices had been scheduled after multiple similar incidents came to light in the wake of her case, suggesting a systemic problem far beyond one flight attendant or one airline. Behind her sat Dr. Carter, Ayanna, and several members of the coalition that had formed around her cause. Esther, still recovering but stabilized, watched via live stream from her hospital room in Atlanta, where Marcus stayed under the watchful eye of a trusted nurse. Across the room, executives from major airlines, including Atlantic Airways CEO Gregory Montgomery, sat stiffly in their corporate attire, flanked by attorneys and public relations specialists. The tension in the air was palpable as the committee chairwoman called the hearing to order. "Dr. Williams," the Congresswoman began, "would you please share your experience with the committee, focusing particularly on what you believe were the systemic factors that allowed this discrimination to occur?" Taking a deep breath, Jasmine recounted her story once more, this time not just as her personal experience, but as a representative voice for the coalition of victims she now led. Dozens of passengers of color who had faced similar treatment, but lacked the resources or platform to fight back effectively. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," she concluded. "It was the predictable outcome of policies that empower employees to act on bias without accountability, training that fails to address unconscious prejudice, and corporate cultures that prioritize silencing complaints over solving problems." The airline executive shifted uncomfortably as Jasmine presented evidence compiled over months of investigation. Statistical analyses showing racial disparities in passenger removals, internal communications revealing preferential treatment, guidelines, and testimonials from former employees about inadequate diversity training. When Montgomery finally took the microphone, his rehearsed statement about Atlantic Airways' commitment to inclusive service rang hollow against the mountain of evidence to the contrary. Under sharp questioning from committee members, he was forced to acknowledge that the airline had no specific metrics for measuring or addressing racial bias in passenger interactions. "So you can't improve what you don't measure," one Senator Bowe observed pointedly, "and you've chosen not to measure this particular problem." As the hearing progressed, the Department of Transportation representative announced a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices across all major carriers, citing Jasmine's case as the catalyst. For the first time since the incident began, Jasmine felt the scales of power shifting perceptibly. The hearing marked a turning point in public perception as well. Major media outlets that had initially framed the story as a she said dispute now reported on the systemic discrimination revealed by the Williams case. Editorial boards called for industry-wide reform, and passengers began sharing their own experiences under hashtags like #TravelingWhileBlack and #Char Airline Accountability. Jasmine's role had evolved from victim to advocate, a transition she hadn't sought but embraced with the same dedication she brought to her medical practice. She found herself speaking at conferences, consulting with civil rights attorneys, and meeting with airline industry representatives who were finally beginning to take the issue seriously. The personal cost remained significant. 3 months of administrative leave had disrupted her medical practice, though Dr. Carter had ensured her position remained secure. The constant travel and advocacy work meant precious time away from Marcus during his important developmental months. And Esther's health, though improved, remained fragile, a constant reminder of the stress this fight had placed on her family. Then came a new complication. Veronica Pearson filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Atlantic Airways, claiming she had been made a scapegoat for company policies. Her lawsuit threatened to drag Jasmine back into litigation just as progress on systemic reforms was gaining momentum. "She's actually doing us a favor," Dr. Carter remarked when the news broke. Her lawsuit will force discovery of internal documents we might never have seen otherwise. He was proven right within weeks. During the discovery process for Veronica's case, a bombshell document emerged. A training manual section that explicitly instructed flight attendants to apply enhanced scrutiny to passengers who appear inconsistent with their stated status or travel class. The examples provided in the manual used coded language that clearly targeted passengers of color, displaying symbols of affluence. The manual's revelation created a media firestorm that forced Atlantic Airways into crisis mode. Other airlines rushed to audit their own training materials, desperate to avoid being caught with similar documentation. Industry associations hastily announced diversity initiatives and bias training programs. For Jasmine, however, the most significant development came in a private meeting requested by Atlantic Airways Board of Directors, without their CEO present. Dr. Williams, the board chairwoman began once they were seated in a neutral conference facility, we want to offer a comprehensive settlement that addresses the systemic issues you've raised, not just your individual experience. The proposal laid before her was unlike anything she had expected. A substantial financial settlement without an NDA, a complete overhaul of training protocols with regular external audits, the creation of a passenger advocacy office with diverse staffing and, most surprisingly, a seat for Jasmine on a newly formed oversight committee that would review and approve all changes. We recognize that throwing money at the problem without addressing the underlying issues would be both morally and financially irresponsible, the chairwoman explained. The industry is changing, and we need to lead that change rather than be dragged into it. Jasmine studied the proposal carefully. And Montgomery? Your CEO has fought these changes at every turn. The board members exchanged glances. Leadership transitions are being discussed. One offered diplomatically. We'll need executives who understand that diversity and inclusion aren't just buzzwords but business imperatives. That evening, Jasmine convened an emergency meeting with her advisory team, Dr. Carter, her attorneys, and representatives from the major civil rights organizations supporting her case. They debated late into the night, weighing the concrete gains offered against the potential achievements of continued litigation. This is more than we could have hoped for 3 months ago, her lead attorney admitted. And it has the advantage of implementation beginning immediately rather than after years of court battles. Dr. Carter was more cautious. The question is whether this sets a strong enough precedent for the industry as a whole or just lets one airline off the hook. As midnight approached, Jasmine stepped away from the debate to call Esther, seeking the wisdom that had guided generations of her family through difficult decisions. Grandma, they're offering real change, but I'm worried it's not enough. What if I settle too soon and miss the chance for bigger impact? Esther's voice, though weakened by illness, carried the same resolute clarity it always had. Child, know when you've won enough to live another day. Our people have been fighting the same battle for centuries. Nobody wins it all in one lifetime. You secure what progress you can, then pass the baton to those who come after. She paused, and Jasmine could picture her sitting up straighter in her hospital bed. Besides, sometimes you can do more as an insider pushing for change than as an outsider throwing stones. Take the seat at the table they're offering. Just don't get comfortable. The wisdom resonated. The following morning, as the nation prepared for the busy holiday travel season, Jasmine authorized her attorneys to finalize the agreement with additional provisions, ensuring transparency and enforcement mechanisms. That evening, as sunset bathed Atlanta in golden light, Atlantic Airways and Jasmine Williams issued a joint statement announcing a comprehensive restructuring of the airline's training, policies, and accountability systems. The statement specifically acknowledged the discriminatory treatment Jasmine had experienced and committed to concrete, measurable improvements in how passengers of color were treated. Social media exploded with reactions, many celebrating the victory, others questioning whether any corporation could truly change its culture. Jasmine watched the debate unfold from Esther's hospital room, her sleeping son cradled in one arm and her grandmother's hand held firmly in the other. It's not the end, she told Esther quietly, but it's a beginning worth fighting for. Esther nodded, a lifetime of hard-won wisdom in her tired eyes. Every movement forward starts with someone refusing to stay in their assigned place. You stood your ground at 30,000 feet, child. Now see how far that stand will carry us all. 1 year later, Jasmine Williams stood in the jetway of Gate C-14 at O'Hare International Airport, adjusting 18-month-old Marcus in his carrier, while the gate agent scanned their boarding passes. The toddler babbled happily, pointing at the colorful safety cards the agent had given him. "Dr. Williams, it's an honor to have you flying with us today," the young agent said, her eyes reflecting genuine respect rather than the wary recognition Jasmine had grown accustomed to in the months following the incident. "We've arranged for pre-boarding whenever you're ready." "Thank you," Jasmine replied with a warm smile, noticing the small pin on the agent's uniform, a new industry-wide symbol indicating completion of the enhanced cultural sensitivity training program that had been implemented across major airlines. As they boarded the aircraft, Jasmine couldn't help but reflect on the press conference 6 months earlier, where she had stood beside Atlantic Airways' new CEO, a black woman with decades of customer service experience, to announce the comprehensive anti-discrimination program they had co-developed. The Williams Standards, as they had become known throughout the industry, established clear guidelines for respectful treatment of all passengers, with specific metrics for accountability and transparent reporting. The flight attendant who greeted them at the door did a subtle double-take of recognition before professionally welcoming them aboard. News coverage had eventually died down, but Jasmine's face had become symbolic of a movement that extended far beyond one incident on one flight. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Williams and little Marcus," the flight attendant said warmly. "We're honored to have you with us today. If you need anything at all during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Jasmine thanked her and made her way to their first-class seats. Not a special accommodation anymore, but the way she now routinely traveled for the speaking engagements and consulting work that had become part of her professional life alongside her medical practice. As she settled Marcus into the window seat beside her, Jasmine recalled the press conference that had marked the beginning of real change. She had stood at the podium, nervous but determined, next to Atlantic Airways' new CEO Diana Roberts, a black woman with 25 years of airline industry experience who had been brought in specifically to transform the company's culture. "Today marks not an endpoint, but a beginning," Diana had announced to the assembled media. "The Williams Standards represent our commitment to ensuring that every passenger is treated with dignity, respect, and fairness, regardless of race, gender, religion, or background." The standards included mandatory quarterly training on unconscious bias for all customer-facing staff, clear escalation procedures for passenger concerns, diverse hiring targets for crew and management positions, and, most importantly, transparent reporting of complaint statistics broken down by demographic factors. What had begun as one airline's response to a PR crisis had rapidly evolved into an industry benchmark, with other carriers adopting similar measures to avoid being perceived as lagging on equality issues. The Department of Transportation had incorporated key elements into its regulatory guidance, and consumer advocacy groups now rated airlines partly on their implementation of anti-discrimination policies. Jasmine's thoughts were interrupted by a flight attendant offering pre-takeoff beverages. She recognized the woman as Tanya Green, who had been her lead attendant on the continuation flight to Atlanta after the incident. "Dr. Williams? I was hoping I'd get a chance to say hello," Tanya said with genuine warmth. "How's your grandmother doing?" "Much better, thank you," Jasmine replied, touched by the personal connection. "She's back home and bossing everyone around again," Tanya laughed. "That's wonderful to hear. And this handsome young man has grown so much." Marcus beamed at the attention, offering Tanya one of his toys, which she pretended to examine with great interest before handing it back. As the cabin filled with other passengers, Jasmine noticed something that would have seemed unremarkable before her experience. A young black mother with an infant was being treated with the same courtesy and assistance as everyone else. No suspicious glances, no extra scrutiny of her baby's bottle, just normal, respectful service. It was a small thing, perhaps, but precisely the kind of small thing that made daily life either dignified or degrading for people of color. And it was exactly the change she had fought for. The flight progressed smoothly, with Marcus napping through most of it. During a quiet moment, A young black woman from several rows back approached hesitantly. "Dr. Williams, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I just wanted to say thank you," she said in a low voice. "I was traveling with my baby last month, and when the flight attendant saw I was having trouble with his formula, she actually helped me prepare it. She mentioned it was part of their new training protocols. I think that's because of you." Jasmine felt a wave of emotion. "Thank you for telling me that," she replied sincerely. "That means more than you know." As the woman returned to her seat, Jasmine reflected on the complex legacy of her fight. The personal cost had been substantial. Months of stress, threats, public scrutiny, and professional disruption. There had been days when she questioned whether it was worth it, whether one incident on one flight justified such an all-consuming battle. But in moments like this, the answer was clear. The changes weren't perfect or complete, but they were real. Someone else's child had been fed without their mother facing humiliation or danger. Progress measured in dignity rather than dollars. Veronica Pearson had eventually found work with a budget airline after her lawsuit against Atlantic Airways was settled confidentially. She had been relegated to shorter, less desirable routes, not officially as punishment, but the industry had its ways of remembering who caused expensive problems. Jasmine took no pleasure in this knowledge. Systemic change had always been her goal, not personal retribution. Dr. Carter had leveraged the attention from the case to launch a national healthcare equity initiative, with Jasmine serving as a key advisor while maintaining her pediatric practice. The hospital administration that had once placed her on protective leave now proudly highlighted her work in their promotional materials, though Jasmine remained clear-eyed about the opportunism behind their support. As the plane began its descent, Marcus woke from his nap and pointed excitedly out the window at the approaching cityscape. His developmental milestones were all on track despite the tumultuous start to his life, a resilience that Jasmine knew came from generations of survival encoded in his DNA. "That's right, baby," she whispered. "We're almost there." The captain's voice came over the intercom, professional and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Atlanta. On behalf of all of us here at Atlantic Airways, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today." As the announcement continued, Jasmine noticed the captain's voice was female, and when she later glimpsed her during deplaning, she saw a black woman in the captain's uniform, her 4 stripes, gleaming under the cabin lights. Their eyes met briefly in a moment of quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition of barriers being dismantled one flight at a time. The plane touched down smoothly, and as passengers prepared to deplane, Jasmine's phone chimed with a text from Dr. Carter. "National Healthcare Equity Initiative meeting confirmed for tomorrow. Transportation Secretary will attend. Your story continues to open doors. Proud of you." Jasmine smiled, tucking the phone away as she gathered Marcus and their belongings. The battle that had begun with a bottle of formula at 30,000 feet had expanded far beyond what she could have imagined that day. Individual fights could indeed change collective journeys, creating safer spaces not just in the skies but in hospitals, schools, and workplaces. As she walked through the terminal with Marcus balanced on her hip, Jasmine reflected on what she would tell him someday about this chapter in their lives. She would explain that change rarely comes from comfort, that justice often requires someone to stand firm when it would be easier to sit down, and that his very existence had been the catalyst for a small but significant shift in how people treat one another. Most importantly, she would tell him that while the world wasn't fair yet, it could be made fairer through persistent, principled action. A lesson passed down from Esther to Jasmine and now to him, a continuous thread of resistance and hope woven through American history. For now, though, Marcus was simply a toddler excited to see his great-grandmother, unaware that the peaceful journey they'd just completed represented a victory that would benefit countless others who would never know his name. And that, Jasmine thought as they stepped out into the Georgia sunshine, was perhaps the most meaningful victory of all. Jasmine's story teaches us powerful truths about confronting racism in America today. First, discrimination often hides behind protocols and procedures, making it harder to identify but no less harmful. Second, Documentation is crucial. Without video evidence and witnesses, Jasmine might have been dismissed as just another angry black woman. The story also reveals how institutions protect themselves rather than victims. Atlantic Airways initially offered money with an NDA rather than accepting accountability. Similarly, Jasmine's hospital placed her on leave for her protection while actually protecting their reputation. Perhaps most importantly, we learned that effective change requires both individual courage and collective action. Jasmine's personal stand created momentum, but lasting transformation came through coalition building, strategic pressure, and institutional reform. Finally, the narrative reminds us that progress is rarely complete. The Williams standards improved conditions, but the work continues. Each generation makes advances that become the foundation for the next. As Grandma Esther wisely observed, know when you've won enough to live another day. True victory lies not just in personal vindication, but in creating safer spaces for those who follow. Have you witnessed or experienced racial discrimination in public spaces? How did you respond? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters in this ongoing conversation. If Jasmine's courage inspired you, hit that like button to help more people discover this important narrative. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a light on social justice issues that mainstream media often overlooks. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that standing up against racism can create real change. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in dignity and respect for all. Remember, when we stand together against injustice, we build a better world for everyone.